I'm Tasneem Essop, and you're listening to Just Access, The Real Transition, a podcast from PARI, the Public Affairs Research Institute. Across this series, we've argued that justice starts with access to power, water, and land, but also to decisions, opportunity, and the terms of the economy itself. For the final conversation, we bring Dr. Tracy Ledger and Dr. Sithembile Mbete into one room. Not to tie a bow on the just transition, but to ask a simpler question. If justice is really just access, what needs to change in politics, in institutions, and in our imagination to make that access real? Before we talk transition, we need a common anchor for Tracy and Sithembile. Justice isn't abstract. It's whether people can actually access clean, affordable energy and the opportunities it unlocks. The just transition, if we see it as an opportunity, what does meaningful change look like in the just transition?
Well, I think that there isn't really agreement on that, on what is meaningful change. And that is one of the issues that have to be addressed in order to deliver justice. So different people have different ideas of the kind of change that the just transition should be bringing. And therefore, they have different ideas of what is justice. So for a lot of people, the just transition is in large part about climate justice. It's about making sure that we reduce emissions so that we can keep global warming below 1.5 or 2 degrees, and thereby we reduce climate impact of emissions, which everybody understands disproportionately affect the poorest and most vulnerable people. Then there are other people who would look at justice in the climate transition as meaning that people who are currently directly employed in coal value chains or the production of electricity, that they are compensated for the loss of their jobs and livelihoods, that coal regions are compensated for the loss of economic activity. But a lot of people would say that we need to talk about a bigger picture of justice. So instead of just looking at the energy system as one part of the transition, as simply being about emissions, and that the only harm that it inflicts on poor and vulnerable people and the only ways that it contributes to poverty and inequality is through its emissions, is to have a look closely at the fundamental inequalities of the energy system. So for a lot of people, equity in an energy transition means having access to more affordable sources of energy. It means having access to cleaner sources of energy. Women and children are disproportionately impacted by the negative impact of burning things like coal and paraffin indoors. So I think that's the first point, is that there isn't one idea of what constitutes justice in the climate transition.
So to bring you in, I mean, we're starting from a position where we're already trying to resolve gaps in equity, in affordability, in service provision, and now you're layering the just transition onto that. I mean, there's an element of that that's being ignored, I think, in the process.
Look, I think, and I agree with you, that there's, our just energy transition and thinking of things like, climate mitigation and adaptation, all that stuff is happening in the context of a deeply unequal economy and a deeply exclusionary political economy. Stephen Friedman always speaks about the insiders and the outsiders, and that the insiders are those that are tied into the formal system, usually economically, because they've got jobs. And so it's in that context that you then have all of these goals for an energy transition of any kind. And the risk of it is that you then just perpetuate that exclusion, that you firstly condemn a bunch of insiders, so those few people with formal jobs within the coal value chain, within the energy sector, to outsider status because they're going to lose their jobs, but also that you then create an economy that continues to exclude and actually increase the number of people that are excluded over time. I think that the opportunity of the just transition is to actually reframe and rebuild the South African economy from its deeply exclusionary, exploitative origins. And when you think of our energy sector and that it was built around the needs of a minerals industrial complex around the mining sector, and that is what drove that kind of mining exploitation and matched then with this racial capitalist logic, or undergirded really by a deep racial capitalism, is the path on which the South African economy is developed. And we have an opportunity with the just transition to upend that. And I think that opportunity isn't coming through enough in the discourse. So we speak about the losses for those who are going to lose their formal jobs and who will be excluded, who will become outsiders from having been insiders. But I don't think we're going beyond to think more broadly about, well, what are the opportunities here for us to restructure the economy as a whole, to look at different industries, different ways of employing people and keeping people occupied, different ways of then distribution of electricity resources, of water resources, that lead us to a more equitable society and economy broadly, beyond just achieving the goals of climate action.
So I think that would be one of my concerns with this idea of green growth, because green growth looks much the same as all the different kinds of growth we've had before now, which have done really nothing to significantly reduce poverty or inequality. And my main concern around these discourses and then visualization of green growth is that they talk about economic inclusion and how we build new industries, but they don't talk about equity. And one of the main reasons why we have such high levels of chronic poverty and inequality in South Africa is not necessarily because people are not included in systems. It's because people are not equitably included in economic systems. So we have this vast number, the working poor, even unemployed people participate in the energy system by buying electricity. They participate in the formal economy by being consumers of goods. If we have a look at people like farm workers, anybody who works at or close to the minimum wage, they're all included in the system. That's not why they're poor. They're poor because of the terms on which they're included. And we keep talking about building an inclusive economy. That's not good enough. We need to build an equitable economy. And when you start thinking about equity and what generates equitable outcomes, then simply replacing a couple of current fossil fuel intensive industries with supposedly carbon neutral industries is not really going to make an impact. So I agree completely with Stay. We need to use this opportunity of the transition to fundamentally reimagine our economy. And there are two basic ways or means of doing that through the transition. The first thing is that the transition broadly is about resources. It's about energy, it's about water, it's about land, it's about mitigating the impact of the climate on those, but also in a more resource scarce future, how do we decide who has access to those resources and what basis do they have access? And I don't see us doing that kind of critical thinking. It's as if we can just continue with the economy looking much the same, except we'll replace carbonized energy with renewable energy and replace the jobs there. And then we'll have this different kind of economy. But we won't have this different kind of economy unless we're very deliberate about it. And one of the opportunities that's presented by the energy transition is that renewable energies gives us the potential to have vast amounts of really cheap electricity, but only if we think about how everybody can access that in a particular way.
We often say inclusion, but on the ground, inclusion without equality is just another form of exclusion, connected but unable to use. So what would it take to design access differently, and who has the imagination and power to do it?
The way that the problem has been defined is actually the root of all of this, right? Where there is this idea that you are just replacing, as Tracy has said, carbon-intensive industry with green industry, but also that you then can just replicate the oligopolistic nature of the minerals energy complex, industrial complex. And you can do that with you do the big wind farms and the big solar, and you've seen the South African private sector, the corporate sector, actually respond in a pretty agile way to just providing their own electricity differently, but not changing the terms on which they operate in any broader sense. And so there's a crisis, I think, of imaginative capacity, of imagining the problem that we're trying to solve differently. And I think it's partly because of this very siloed way of thinking about the country's challenges, right? So you think of land discretely, you think of water as its own thing, you think of the crisis in municipalities as one thing, you think of Eskom as one thing, you think of all of these international agreements that we've signed as something else, and not seeing it as a holistic process and as interrelated parts of a whole. And if you're trying to change the whole economy, then these are all different points of intervention that you could actually exploit in really creative and impactful ways for a broader social change. But I just don't think that there is even that imagination in the way that any of our political actors are thinking about this issue. And then, therefore, there's the wrong kind of political will. I think that, depending on which quarters you're in, there's differentiated political will around the commitments that have been made for the energy transition, and all of the sort of climate commitments that we've made. I think that there's a variation of commitment to that, but I don't think that's the political will that's at issue. I think the big thing is, what do we want our politicians to be committed to? What do we want the political will to be working towards as far as any comprehensive thinking of reforming the economy? And I think the reality is that I don't think there's the political will to have the difficult conversation about what would it take to fundamentally transform this economy. And so if you did have, as Tracy has said, a transition that leads to a massive amount of decentralized, affordable, easily accessible electricity, what kind of economic futures do you have for people there, right? Because it allows you to break big oligopolies, and all of our sectors, finance, retail, agriculture, mining, are centered around 3, 4, 5 big firms. So what does it mean to be able to break that concentration down? Or how are you able to break that concentration down if you have cheap, accessible, decentralized electricity supply? And then what kind of economies can people build that are also good for them as labor? What jobs do you create? And what kind of livelihoods are people able to make in that kind of context? And we just haven't had that thought. It's as far as, can the big miners get access to cheap electricity so that they can export more? And that's it. That's as far as the conversation goes. But we're not having a conversation of, well, what would this mean for decentralizing our economy? Not by breaking down the monopolies and then distributing shares to different people, but actually by creating new and different types of economic paths and livelihoods for ordinary people.
Decentralized, affordable electricity isn't only a technical plan, it's a political one. It can loosen concentrated power in the economy and open space for new livelihoods if we choose to structure access that way.
I mean, I agree with very much that idea that there's a failure of imaginative capacity, but I don't think it's just within the state. I think it's within the private sector as well. I would imagine that at least some public officials would say, we can't talk about economic alternatives in that way because it'll upset the business sector. And that is because of a failure of imagination in the business sector, who think that any alternative involves I don't know, nationalization of industries or breaking up industries, as if there aren't a million alternative ways to organize an economy in a way that you have more equity and more prosperity. There are many, many, many countries around the world that are more equitable than South Africa, that are more prosperous than South Africa, that have higher standards of living from South Africa, lots of private sector companies. So there's a failure of imagination in the business sector, in the corporate sector, to actually sit down and say, what are all the ways in which we can do things differently?
Just a point here, this dual failure on the private sector and the state means that we're also then just replicating old ways of capital distribution, right? Because you currently have this battle between sort of post-94 black capital that's heavily invested in the coal sector, and that has a lot to lose from the transition, and justly so, right? I was at an event on Saturday and Joel Tenze spoke, and he said, look, in a capitalist economy, he's like, many people are going to hate me for saying this, but in a capitalist economy, part of transformation meant that we needed to create black capitalists, right? And there's a whole black capitalist class that was created out of mining, and particularly out of gold mining in the last few years. The established white capital were very early investors in renewables and in, this new energy future. And so they have a lot to gain from the energy transition. They also have a lot to lose from political will swaying, in a different way. But it's the same terms of conversation, same terms of engagement. We're not moving beyond that to say, well, what would it look like? Could a just transition lead to less concentrated capital, or reduce the concentration of capital and resources in any, whether it's the old guard or the newer guard? And how do you have a healthier conversation about what the opportunities are with capitalists, right? Both with the old white monopoly capital and with, post-94 black capital. How do you have a conversation that is a healthy one about what is it that's going to keep this country sustainable? Because the other thing, and back to your opportunity question, if we don't harness the opportunity that we have with the just transition and the amount of money that's being thrown at it currently, if we don't harness this to fundamentally reshape our economy, the whole system is going to collapse because there are so many people excluded from the system. 70% of young people are systemically excluded from being productive participants of the economy. And yet you have a country where over 65% of your population is under the age of 35. So what future is there for anyone if you can't solve the puzzle of how do you create an economy that is more equitable, that allows for a future for those, and particularly young people who are excluded, and what are the different ways of livelihoods that you can then imagine and create, and how can we put capital behind the development of those different economies and those different businesses and different ways of just living, that actually will keep the rich rich. That's the other thing, is that they've got so much money, but the options are not to impoverish the rich. And in fact, this inertia that we are in is what over time is impoverishing different levels of deeply unequal society. You've had this erosion of the middle class. You're having an erosion of the upper middle class, who are incredibly privileged relative to the people at the very bottom, but whose quality of life and what they can afford is actually shrinking over time. And so it's good for everyone to be thinking of how we restructure things better and to undo the deep dysfunction that was a necessary feature of the racial capitalism that defined this country, for at least for as long as South Africa's been a state, since 1910, but arguably, long before then. And so that's the big question, I think, that we need to grapple with. And I think that unions, the broader civil society sector, has been so attached to And understandably so, right? The fight around, people who are going to lose formal jobs and formal opportunities, so attached to the fight around, capital just being continuously enriched by the same capital being enriched by the energy transition and those policies, also fighting the battles about what's being imposed from the outside and what, onto the people, and the deeply undemocratic nature of some of the decisions and the choices that have been made, that it's almost crowded out space for opportunity and for imagining about actually how could we harness this moment differently to serve the broadest part of the population.
What we've heard so far is that the just transition can't be reduced to a technical swap, coal out, renewables in. Because exclusion without equity reproduces exclusion. And cheap, decentralized energy isn't only an engineering question, it's a political choice about who gets to benefit and what kind of economy we're building. In the next and final episode of the show, we pick up on the conversation and turn to the other foundations of access, land and water, and the governance systems that decide who can use them, who can benefit, and who gets heard before decisions are made. I'm Tasneem Essop, and you've been listening to Just Access, The Real Transition, a podcast from PARI, the Public Affairs Research Institute. To learn more about PARI and their research, visit pari.org.za. If you found this episode useful, please like, follow, or subscribe, and share it with others, and keep listening.